Welcome to our Build-A-Brain overview of the brain. Just like your body, your brain is symmetrical, vertically symmetrical, so that you have a left eye, a right eye, a left cheek, a right cheek. And here we see the same kind of organization on the inside of the brain, the core brain, so that we see the brainstem has the left side and the right side, which are mirror images of each other. The pons, which is the structure above that, has exactly the same thing, a left side and the right side. And above that, we have, first of all, the thalami, the left side and the right side. The thalami are two egg-shaped structures on either side of the divide between the two hemispheres. And then riding on top of the horse, there is a structure called the hippocampus, which is in brown and which might be the legs of a rider on a horse. And in front of the hippocampi on both sides, there is a structure called the amygdala, or the almond, because people thought that it looked like an almond. And then on top of the hippocampi and amygdalas, there is a structure in very light blue called fluid ventricles, quite elegant structures. And this is actually not a neural structure, but it's a space for a fluid that is called cerebrospinal fluid. The next structure we see is the basal ganglia, quite beautiful. It looks like a kind of a shield on the left side and on the right side. The basal ganglia are for motor control. In the rear of the brain, again straddling the brainstem, there is a structure called the cerebellum, and the word cerebellum is related to the word cerebrum. Cerebrum means brain. Cerebellum means little brain. And here you see a very nice cut through the cerebral cortex showing the white matter. On top, right now, you see the largest structure of the brain and the central nervous system called the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex, or sometimes just plainly the cortex. The gray matter is what you look at from the outside, because that's the very surface layer of the cerebral cortex. The brain is the biggest part of the central nervous system, and the central nervous system basically consists of the spinal cord and the brain. The brain is a kind of an enormous outgrowth of the spinal cord. You see in front of you a little piece of the spinal cord at the very bottom of the drawing. The brainstem emerges out of the spinal cord the way the crown of a tree emerges out of the trunk of a tree. And this vertical Build-A-Brain structure is pretty much the way the core of the brain appears. The core of the brain essentially holds everything else in place. So we can start at the bottom with the brainstem, or the lower brainstem. Then we move upward to the structure called the pons, which means the bridge. What you see here is the lower brainstem. Brainstem refers to everything that you see here in light blue and a little darker blue also. And then above that, we have two egg-shaped structures, one on the left side of the brain, the other one on the right side of the brain, called the thalami. Thalami is always plural because there's one on the left side and one on the right side, and each of the thalamus sprouts outward to its own part of the cortex. So the left thalamus relates to the left hemisphere, and the right thalamus relates to the right hemisphere. And all these things are interconnected. And each of these terms came into use at a time when Latin was the language of medicine. Everybody spoke Latin, even if they were French or German or Italian. So these are Latin terms, but they're not very difficult to remember, and they all have a reason why they are called what they are called. Now you see a new structure that kind of straddles the brainstem with shapes that go around the brainstem. And the brown shapes are called the hippocampus. There's two of them, so we can call them the hippocampi. It's an important structure. You can see something that looks a little bit like a rider on a horse with red knees and brown riding trousers. And that's a simple way, a nice way to think about the relationship between these structures. Right in front of the tip of the two hippocampi on both sides, there are small structures called amygdalas. The amygdalas, the word amygdala means almond, and it's because the initial anatomists thought, gee, this looks like an almond, let's call it that. It's just a way to remember these structures. And then on top of the hippocampi and amygdalas, there is a structure in very light blue called fluid ventricles, quite elegant structures. And this is actually not a neural structure, but it's a space for a fluid that is called the cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrum means brain, spinal means spinal, and fluid means fluid. This is a very important structure, but it doesn't consist of neurons. It is basically a supply channel to feed important molecules and cells and hormones to the tissue that it surrounds. So this is the internal circulatory system of the brain and spinal cord. The brain has a separate circulatory system because you don't want to get blood products into the brain, and you don't want to get brain products into the bloodstream. Very much like a bloodstream, but only for the central nervous system. The next structure we see is quite beautiful. It looks like a kind of a shield on the left side and on the right side. All these structures are symmetrical, by the way. Everything on the left side is copied in mirror image on everything on the right side. The basal ganglia are very important. People who, with damage to the basal ganglia, have trouble with movement and walking and probably speech as well. The basal ganglia are for motor control. The word motor in anatomy means muscular. So for muscular control, controlling the enormous number of muscles that we have in our bodies is as complicated as taking in the enormous number of sensory nerves on the input side of the brain. In the rear of the brain, again straddling the brainstem, there is a structure called the cerebellum, and the word cerebellum is related to the word cerebrum. Cerebrum means brain. Cerebellum means little brain, because the cerebellum really looks tremendously much like the enormous cortex, but it's a smaller structure, although it has just about as many neurons. Inside, they are just smaller neurons. So these are all very densely packed structures filled with neurons and fibers and all kinds of things that do the actual information processing in the brain. And here you see a very nice cut through the cerebral cortex showing the white matter. And remember that the white matter is white because the neurons, which are grayish, are surrounded by white cells called glial cells, Glial, which looked to the early anatomists like a kind of a glue because they didn't have high-powered microscopes. On top, right now, you see the largest structure of the brain and the central nervous system called the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex, or sometimes just plainly the cortex. I usually just say cortex because everybody in the field will understand that word to refer to the enormous outer structure that you see there. The gray matter is what you look at from the outside because that's the very surface layer of the cerebral cortex. The brain is an enormous structure, and it has multi-scale organization, meaning that there's organization at the level of single cells, and we're talking about 100 million cells altogether.